Well, I was the youngest of 5 children and lucky to be born as far as that goes. And we grew up on a farm, and Dad had a farm and probably had as many crop failures as he did good crops. And we had hard times and everything, and it was rough on him, but we had a good life, had a good family life. Family was very important to Mother and Dad. They loved their children, they loved their grandchildren, and they just thought they were special. And that was very important because family is family. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Mary Cox Ledbetter, Walter Leroy Cox, Robert Cox, and Irma Lee Cox Beeks. My family business, my dad was a farmer, and that was all he did to make money. And the only money crops usually was strawberries, and he grew them for money. And we always raised all our garden stuff and canned it, and he plowed the garden, and he didn't have any electrical equipment. It was horses, plowed and mowed and everything like that with them. He did sell a little bit of milk a few years. I don't know what my part was in the family business. Of course, we all had our little chores, and mine was probably less than my brothers and sisters since I was the youngest and everything. But I know we always had to carry in stove wood, which is wood that you use in the cook stove, and sometimes put the heating stove wood on the porch and do the dishes and things mostly like that. And my sister and I'd always kind of fuss about doing the dishes because I had to stay there till she got them all washed and I dried them. And at that time we didn't have anything to scratch if something was stuck, and she'd always save a knife back, and she wouldn't let me leave till she got that skillet clean because I had to dry that knife. I lived probably about 8 miles west of where the Federal Square is, and it's on Weddington Hamstring Road off of, we called it Highway 16 at the time. Now they call it Weddington Road. And that's where I grew up, and I'm living back just across the road on some of the same land that my parents owned at that time. And I remember thinking as a kid sitting out on the porch with Dad, I thought them trees across a hill look so pretty, and I thought, gee, I sure wish I could own that someday, and thank goodness I do. The only jobs that I ever did was picking beans and picking strawberries that made any money because we lived so far away to do much of anything else. Excuse me. And we always had to buy our school books when I went to high school, buy our material for dresses and everything, and we spent what money we made on that. And there was a few years that Dad let my sister and I have a small bean patch, and we would get the money of all the beans that was sold, and we'd divide that up. I attended White Rock Grade School my first 7 years, because I didn't start school until I was 7. And when I did, because of my brothers and sisters in front of me, I went through the primer first and second grade that year. And then so I finished there for 7 years. And then I started to Farmington in 1942 and had to walk about 3 miles to catch the bus. And I went to Farmington then through the next 4 years and graduated from Farmington in 1946. The school bus where we caught it was probably about 7 o'clock time we caught it. And so I had to leave home about 6 o'clock. And sometimes I would have somebody to walk with part of the way, and one year I didn't. And in the wintertime, about 6 o'clock, it would be dark. And one year I was walking by myself. And sometimes when you start out and go outside and it's pretty dark and cloudy, when you first get out, your eyes aren't accustomed to the night, and you'd have to look straight up to be sure that you stayed in the road. But I enjoyed it really. The walking was probably good for me. But because I was used to walking, I had to walk 2.5 miles to go to grade school. So I was used to walking. Well, my earliest members of Farmington, after going to grade school, and Farmington wasn't very big at that time, but it was to me. I thought, boy, I was such a tomboy, and everybody, we went in there, and all the girls just stand around and talk. And I thought, I'd like to be out there playing ball or doing something. So I thought it was probably, to begin with, it was kind of trying to get accustomed to it. It wasn't, but I really always liked school, any school as far as that goes. I really enjoyed school. There was Broyles, which was a store, and he was run the post office also. Eureka White or White store, and it was either Neal's or McNeil's. Well, as I say, I always enjoyed school, and I enjoyed the teachers, and I can't remember a lot of them, not old age, of course, but anyhow, I know H.E. Broyles was our superintendent, and Joe Fred Starr was our principal. And then we had Mrs. King was our teacher, one of our teachers. I had about 20 when I started, and of course some of them came from Mount Comfort and other places, and they finished school other places. We had some come all the way from Wheeler to walk to catch the bus, which was even further than I had to walk. And so we had several, and by the time we ended, we ended up with 9. But that first year my class was down in the basement, and that was when there were so many. And I guess I had a cousin, I guess, for one thing, that was in my class the first 3 years that I went to school, and she was a good friend. And there's Gracie Buchanan that I had went to school with at White Rock 2 or 3 years, and she was in the class in high school, except for 1 year when she was in California. Theelda Broyles and June Bell Lashley, Max Newport from Wheeler, and Jack Decker, and then at the last there was Gene Stapleton and several others, Randall Garrison for the earlier years. And well, I think one of the things that I thought about when we had a reunion, we'd had one in 46, but we had one in 2001. And we invited, our class sponsored it, but we invited everybody that had graduated from Farmington before 1950 and before. And one thing that was really interesting, I thought was interesting, was Lawrence Lewis. He graduated in 1931, and he was the oldest one back that graduated there that we had. The rest of them were all deceased, and he was the only one in his class. And he told us that when he went to Farmington High School, that he had to, the last semester, he had to go to Federal High because he was going to go to university, and Farmington wasn't accredited at that time. And so him and somebody else, and I'm not sure who it was, also went up there to the last semester at Federal. And I thought that was really interesting. And I met so many people that was talking about things, that how everything was and everything like that. And it was, I don't know, I always liked it. I didn't think I liked history till I get into genealogy or something like that. And then I find out it is really interesting. Well, when I was in grade school, which is at Farmington, when I was in grade school, we just played ball out on the grounds and played running games like, I can't really think of what all the games was. And as I say, I was a tomboy and things like that, and so I always liked that, and I was just about as good as the boys. But in Farmington, when we went, we were a small school, and so they had baseball a little bit, and basketball, but they didn't have enough people there to have a football team. But just think about what they've got now. I don't know whether we thought about having fun, but we did. As I say, we played. We even visited on the way home, and taken probably twice as long to come home as it did to go. And I always played out in the yard and made little rock houses with rocks around a tree. And then we played little games. We played book and Chinese checkers and things like that. Well, I grew up with my dad loving pitch card game, pitch and dominoes, checkers. He was really good at that, and my brothers and sisters were too. And I always liked pitch. I go to the senior center now and play pitch about twice a week. Enjoy it. So it's, I grew up with, with the sports and everything. Started going over there when they met at the city hall, and they met about once a week, I believe. And Sang Avenue brought out the meals from at that time, and they was, that was where the other senior center at Fayetteville was built, and they brought meals out there, and I think they delivered to some people. But they brought meals out there once a week, and they usually had music there. And we had one little old room that they let us, and somebody had music. And of course, I'm sure the policemen and everything didn't enjoy all that noise going on next door. But that's where it kind of started, and then they started wanting to raise money and things like that. And I think that Mrs. Broyles had gave money to probably to the city or something like that, but I'm not sure. And so they used part of that money to start the building, and I think maybe the seniors from Harrison or somebody else may have gave some money, and the people had worked hard to raise more money. To buy the furniture and stuff to begin with. Well, they would have chili suppers and things like that to raise money, and sometimes make things and sell it. When I went to church as a kid, we had to walk about 2.5 miles, and most of the time we went to Providence, and at that time it was located just probably a quarter of a mile off of Whittington Road, right across, go down Blue Jay Lane, I think it is now. And then later they moved on 16 West from some land that was partly donated by Hugh Martin. And occasionally we went to cut across the hills and went to Sycamore Baptist Church, but not too much, not very often. Well, it seems like it just kind of, the last few years or several years, it just really multiplied, and it just grew up till you don't know when you're in Farmington or when you're in Prairie Grove or Fayetteville or anything, because it's so many stores, many houses and everything. And at that time there was just a few people scattered out. There was mostly farmers, or a few stores, but mostly farmers and things like that lived around there. Russell Broyles was, as I said, had a store in Farmington, and he was a postmaster. And later in life, probably in the 1950s, my husband rented a building from him and had a garage there. And so he had it for 3 or 4 years before we moved to Texas for a while. And so he was always pretty good and offered to sell the land pretty cheap at that. It probably wasn't cheap at that time, but we missed a good bargain because we didn't buy it. And that land now, part of it, the school got part of it, and now Chicken Holler has the other part. Hogo Bo Hickman lived just right there in the old Broyles house, and he come over quite a bit at the garage. And while Marvin was running the garage, Bill Beckett told me when he was in school, he would crawl out of the window at high school and go down there and play hooky. And I asked him what his dad thought about that. He said, well, his dad didn't care, but his mama didn't know it. Marvin mostly worked on cars and trucks or whatever, and that was really just what he did. He was a mechanic. He had been a mechanic at Fayetteville at 2 different places before and decided he wanted to be on his own. And so that was about 3 or 4 years probably that he was a mechanic there. I know that Hobo was kind of over it, and I understand that they had about 400 acres of different kinds of crops, and apples, peaches, and trees and everything, grapes. And it seemed like I read something about the fact that they had probably 100 workers at one time. And I couldn't hardly believe that when I was going over to Farmington, because it didn't seem like it was that much. It had went down. I think when the railroad kind of went out, it kind of played out a lot on that. And you probably know about probably the first school was Ebenezer School and then Hawthorne later. And the high school was probably built about 1924. And I don't know when the grade school, I'm sure it's before that, the last grade school before. And now then, of course, the schools, they got 3 or 4 different schools at different places now. And so it has really grew up and everything. I think that when you think about the town of Farmington as a whole, it is a very friendly town. And I think most of the merchants there are very friendly. They have 3 or 4 real good churches. One of them, especially Main Street Baptist Church. My son's a pastor there, so I had to put in a plug for Preston. But all the churches are really, really, really nice. My favorite thing about Farmington is, of course, this church, Main Street Baptist Church, and the Farmington Senior Center, because I have met so many wonderful people there at the Farmington Senior Center that I never knew before, and they're all just so friendly and good, and I just can't imagine not knowing all those people, because most of them that's going at the Farmington Senior Center at this time, I didn't know until I started going to the Farmington Senior Center, and we just have a good time over there doing different things. Of course, my main thing is playing pitch, but there's other things there that a lot of other people like. They have singing, and then they have dances and everything at Farmington Senior Center, and they have everything about anybody would like to go, and they can get a good meal and meet a lot of people. I met some great friends there. I know that one year, probably in the 1950s, my dad had a small strawberry crop, and on strawberries you would usually set the plants out one year and keep the runners off and get them going, and the second and third and first, second, and then the next 3 years you'd pick them. And his crop was just about gone. It wasn't too big at that time, and he'd always before taken his strawberries to Springdale, and they'd bid on them. But that one year he'd taken them to Farmington, and I think they shipped them out from Farmington, but I don't know whether what I read now, they didn't have a railroad there at that time. And we probably didn't have but 2 or 3 crates or something at that time, and so that's probably why he'd taken them to Farmington, and he divided the money up between him and Mother and I, because we were the only ones at home, and so we shared that. And I remember they didn't bring very much, and I don't know whether very many people know at that time a crate of strawberries was 24 quarts. You'd put them in a crate, put 8 quarts at the bottom, a little filter over them, and then put another 8 quarts of the little filter over them, and then another 8 quarts, and then tack the lids on them. That was 20, and probably you could buy a quart of strawberries now, and it cost as much as a crate used to. When we were growing up, you had kerosene lamps, and all the time that I was at home, we never had electricity. I remember when we got a Aladdin lamp, and we thought that was great because it's a little brighter than the other lamps. And so you'd carry your lamps from one room to another sometimes, but most of the time you had them in the same room. And nowadays, if you thought you had that kerosene lamp, you think it's still dark, I think. But we didn't have any electricity, and after I was married, I lived off of Weddington Road, and it was probably about 1949, I imagine, and probably at my parents too, before we got rural electricity. And of course, at that time, they first just put about one outlet and a place for a ceiling lamp or something, because they didn't know that they was going to have so much things to plug in like they do now. And it was a real help to everybody, to all the farmers especially, and because we had all of that. And when we're talking about lights and getting lights and everything, I'd like to tell a story about my sister and I and Mother went to Fayetteville one night, probably a Saturday night, with my uncle and his wife and children. And my sister said it was the first time she'd ever been to town at night. And the thing that was so amazing to her about was all those lights and everything up at Fayetteville, because we didn't have lights here, but I mean, there was a lot of them. The thing that I thought about it was that it was terrible, because we went to a Western movie, and I sat there and cried through the thing because them people was killing each other. And Mom had to take me out I don't know how many times, but I was just really upset about them people killing each other. Well, the ones that made a lot of a difference was a refrigerator, because before that, you know, it was hard to keep food. You couldn't keep it from one day to the next. And sometimes it was hard to keep milk, you know, from very long. And then getting to have a washing machine, wow, that was great. Better than using an old rubber board, for sure. The water was heated in a dish pan on top of the stove. And that's on a wood cook stove. The water, when you was doing the dishes or cooking the meal, and they was usually put the pan on, and dish pan water and on, and then used an old bar, probably could be lye soap sometimes, and wash the dishes with that. Well, I know that my dad believed in hoeing the crops. When he had crops out, he thought if he plowed them, there's one thing about it, Dad kept the rows clean. He was good about plowing them, so it wasn't hard. But he thought once he plowed them, they was supposed to be hoed every place that he didn't get in between them. And so him and Mother always had a good garden, and his field crops, he always had kept them clean. And I remember how much that he always tried to do the hardest work. I remember during the war, when the war started, I was the last one at home, and I had to help him when he was cutting hay and things like that. And so he would mow the hay with a couple of horses, and then when it got dry enough, he would rake it with a rake, with pulling the teams, and he would go around the field once or twice, and then he would let me drive the rake, and he would try to, we would have to put the hay in shocks to load it on the wagon, and he would let me, and I'd finally I'd do fine for a while, but I'd kind of get a little crooked, and he'd come along, straighten me up on it, and then he would have to load the hay on the wagon, and I'd get up on top and keep it stacked down. That you had a special wagon you'd have these flat like that that you put on for hay and hauling hay, and you keep it stomped down so you would get it up there. And so Dad was good about knowing where to put the hay, and I didn't have to move it much because he could pretty well place it. When it got pretty tall, you might have to move it around, but you had to keep it stomped down and everything so that it would stay on the wagon. It would come up to the barn, and we had a fork that was in the back of the barn that was on a runner, went across, and you would pull it down and put it down onto the hay and open it up and stick it on the hay on the wagon like that, and then pull it down and it'd hold it. And then behind the barn, there was a line that came down, and there's a horse that would pull the line out that way, and they'd pull it up to the barn and then back, and wherever it was supposed to fall, you'd pull the rope in front, and it would dump the hay there. And when it started getting full, Dad would have to get up there and say when to do it, and Mom would have to pull the horses. But when he first started in, and we still got the fork. I still got the barn, still got the fork. Maybe about to fall down, but I still got it. And that was happy days. And I learned at that time, I learned how to harness the horses. I couldn't do it now, though. With me being the youngest, I was probably, I probably didn't have it as hard as my brothers and sisters did. I do remember when Dad had some strawberries way over on the hill that they were going over and they had just put some out, and some of them was going to plow. But to keep, when you put your strawberries out, if I knew a bed, you had to keep the blooms broke off. So, and they would put out runners and put out more plants by keeping the blooms blocked off. And I was just about 4 years old, and I begged to go over there because everybody else is going over there, me and Mom. And they said, well, you wouldn't work, because I was just that young. And I said, I will. Well, I wanted to go back, so I worked hard, and I never got out of doing that again. That was always my job after that. But I really enjoyed living out on the farm. I liked being out in the country life. Well, times are different. Sometimes I think that they may, the children, kids may miss a lot of being around and growing up with family as much as they would used to have to be, you know, and things like that. And I don't know whether, I guess it's good and bad. I think sometimes maybe they're not as close. I don't know whether that's true or not. But I know at times, you know, back then, sometimes the kids, people had large families, and families all helped out to make the living and things like that.